So this is part two of the video I was doing regarding Kwame Brown and Kevin Samuels, and it's known as I call it black cracker culture, and I'll explain that. And I know that's not a term that's very popular. It's considered a derogatory term, but it has been used as a derogatory term in recent times. But when we go back to the root of it, and again, most of the time when we look at things, we look at it from a perspective of being reactionary. We don't look at things in the broader historical perspective. And because of that, we miss out on a lot of it. And it's easy to manipulate a situation. And so, as I was saying in part one, I was talking about Kwame Brown and how recently he's become very popular. And it's a pretty good thing, because although he has been attacked for about 20 years, for those of you who I'd encourage you to go back and look at the first video, part one. But for those of you who are not familiar with Kwame Brown, he was the #1 overall pick in the NBA draft in 2001, right out of high school. And he was only about 18 years old. A lot of pressure on him. He was playing with the Washington Wizards. Michael Jordan, of course, was on the team. And Michael Jordan is an intense, very aggressive competitor. And because of that, it was difficult for Kwame Brown to really get a foothold in the league. But ultimately in the league, he played for 12 seasons. He made tens of millions of dollars. The one estimate was about over $60 million he made during his NBA career. And so although they're trying to say that that was a bust or a failure, it was based on other people's expectations and not his. Because when you look in the larger scheme of things, there's no one in their right mind that would say, if you're 39 years old, I think he's about 39 now, you're 39 years old, you're retired, and you've already made $60 million. You really don't have to work if you don't want to. You can just live your life based on how you want to live your life. But a lot of times it's based on other people's expectations. People are trying to attach to you how you should live your life. And a lot of times it's to fit in a false narrative. And that false narrative creates a situation or circumstance where you're not living life based on how you think you should live it, but you're basing on other people's expectations. I talked a little bit about Kevin Samuels, and I did a video about him. He's very popular right now because of him really promoting the idea of masculinity. And so the current cultural climate gives a false sense of masculinity, which is why these two young men are considered kind of controversial in this day and age for what they're saying and how we valued manhood in the wrong way. I also talked about how this culture that we have embraced as Black culture currently is not really Black culture. It didn't originate in Africa. It's not something that was created organically in America by Black people or people of African descent, but it really originates from what is known as white cracker culture. And that came from, I know it's funny to say it, but it's an actual word that was used in Europe. And even Shakespeare quoted it in one of his books, King John. He talks about, he uses the term cracker. And so a cracker was really identification for certain groups of people that were Scottish or Irish. That's a part of Great Britain, but the Scottish and the Irish were considered to be a lower, of a lower class of people than some of the aristocrats or the kind of ruling elite class in Great Britain. And they had a culture of their own. So a lot of the words that we've adopted, like when you say this instead of this, some of the terms and some of the words and phrases that we've adopted as Black culture actually originated from the European white culture, and which was called the cracker culture. Now, they were known for being sexually promiscuous, very violent, very braggadocious, very loud and boisterous. And, that's why a lot of our aspects of our Black culture is actually derived from that. Now, how did that happen? Because these people in this region, in Scottish, Irish part of Great Britain, they were transported over here also during the time of the colonies, when the original colonies came. And so they were transported as indentured servants. And so they were the same as the Black people. Now, the Black people from Africa, it was translated from regular indentured servitude to chattel slavery Some accounts say in the 1680s. So from 1619, you had blacks and Europeans that were being transported as indentured servants. They would fulfill their obligation as indentured servants, and then they were free. And but then around, I believe it was about maybe 1660 or so, you had this black slave master by the name of Anthony Johnson, who had an escaped slave. The slave actually, after he did his time as an indentured servant, looked to escape. And then Anthony Johnson went back and got him and recaptured him, went to court and fought for the right to call this slave property. And so therein started the concept of chattel slavery, which means that these people were now property and they didn't have the same rights as a human being. But if you understand that this cracker culture, that these people that were in the South and the cracker group of people, also, some people call them rednecks. It actually, they were in Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and northern Florida. And so because of their interaction with black people in the South, many of the Southern blacks picked up their culture, even some of their language and how they spoke and how they said certain things. And even like the pig entrails, which we call chitlins, is still a delicacy in the Scottish Irish part of Great Britain. And so these aren't new things that were created here. They were learned from a group of people that originated in Europe. Here's by the 1760s, the English, both at home and in colonial America, were applying the term to Scottish Irish settlers of the southern backcountry, as in the passage from a letter to the Earl of Dartmouth. He writes, "I should explain to your lordship what is meant by crackers, a name they have got from being boasters. They are a lawless set of rascals of the frontiers of Virginia, Maryland, and Carolinas and Georgia, who often change their places of abode. The word then came from to be associated with the cowboys of Georgia and Florida, many of them descendants of those early frontiersmen." And that's from that's the writing of John Burleson. In 2002, he wrote a book about the Georgia crackers. And so, again, what we've done is we've adapted a certain culture that wasn't our culture. We've been told that this is our culture, and now we have adopted it as though it really is. For instance, let me give you an example. In the 1960s, you had the Black identity culture of the 60s and 70s. So what happens, you have these white intellectuals, these liberals that actually came up with this idea that Black people needed to be in touch with their culture, but they didn't really gravitate towards a true culture. They gravitated towards the culture they had learned. Now, blacks in the North and even whites in the North looked down on this particular culture. So when blacks were migrating from the South northward, it was the culture that they were rejecting, not the people, which is why even some of the black middle-class blacks of the North separated themselves from those who migrated from the South. Some of these black people that adopted this, we call them black rednecks. In Thomas Sowell's 2005 book, he calls them black rednecks because they adapted that culture. And so even blacks in the North distanced themselves from those blacks who had adopted their culture, but it was because of culture and not color. Now, think about a lot of the blacks that migrated from the South, and they migrated in northern cities, and they kind of all went into ghetto areas. And so that culture began to continue in the North. And even to this day, you see that same type of culture in what we call the hood or the ghetto or whatever the case may be, but it doesn't originate from Africa. If you really want to know the true culture of the Negro, those who were transported over, check the Bible. You know, that is I know that's not a popular thing to say, but if you understand the identity of those who were transported, called Negroes, and transported from Africa, it is historically accurate to say that many of them were descendants of the Hebrew people that came from Israel. Now, I'm going to tell you a couple of different facts, and then I'm going to move on to the next thing. So if you understand Israel from a biblical perspective, you had the 10 northern tribes. When Israel split, you had the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes. Now, the 10 northern tribes, they left Israel and went north, which is why they're called the northern tribes. You have those who stayed in Israel. Now here's another fact that a lot of people won't tell you. The powers that be wants to not acknowledge the fact that Israel is actually in Africa. I know a lot of people don't want to say that. They'll call it the Middle East, and there's a lot of fighting in the Middle East right now. Israel's on the continent of Africa. There's no such thing as Middle East. That was a term that they came up with so that they didn't have to acknowledge the fact that Israel is actually on the continent of Africa, just like Egypt is, which is why when the children of Israel left Israel, they were able to, left Egypt, they were able to walk to Israel. Now, after 70 AD, when the Romans came into Jerusalem and conquered Jerusalem, many of the southern tribes that were of Israel that were still in Israel fled south into Africa. They fled south because, of course, the Romans were coming from the north, so they fled south. And what happened is when the Europeans got there during the time of the 1500s and 1600s and even late 1400s, they found a lot of these people that were identified as Negroes that they had been captured by the Mohammedan Muslims. And so you had the Muslims in Africa that actually captured these descendants of Israel and held them captive. And so when they held them captive, when the Europeans came over, European people didn't come over, just start snatching people in Africa off the streets. They were trading with other African tribes, and most of them were Muslims. They call them Mohammedan Muslims. Muhammad himself, who was the founder of Islam, in his writings, he referred to these black people very negatively in his writings. Muhammad was actually white too. A lot of people don't want to acknowledge that. The Prophet Muhammad of Islam would be considered white. How do you know this? First of all, the Arab people originated from the Caucasoid regions, also known as the Caucasoid Mountains, which is where we get the term Caucasian from. And in the writings, the Hadith and the Quran, they identify Muhammad as being white-skinned. So he's a white-skinned Caucasian, which means he's a Muslim. He spoke very poorly about the dark-skinned and black-skinned people of Africa and called them raisin heads and different other terms. This is all documented, so you can look it up for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. So these people were captured. And then when the Europeans came over, they did a lot of trading with them for other commodities. And so then they transported many of them here to America, which is another reason why I believe very much so that one of the things that they did when they brought these Negroes, they call them, when they brought them here, they stripped them of their language and their culture. And they split up their families because most of the culture is passed down through the fathers and through orally in the ancient times. And so these people didn't know their culture. They didn't know their heritage or their history, didn't even know their names or their own language. So because they didn't know their own language or their own culture, they didn't know their real culture, they adapted the culture of those around them, which is where we get them adapting what is known as the white cracker or redneck culture. So when you look at people in the ghetto, they have the same traits, cultural traits. The people in the ghetto, not everybody, but for the most part, the people in the ghetto, they have the same cultural traits as was described by the European whites called crackers, right? They weren't considered high in society. They were low in society. And so criminality, laziness, debauchery, sexual immorality, being loud and boisterous or braggadocious were some of the descriptions of their culture, right? When you get a chance, you can read some other publications that will tell you this as well. Again, I love Thomas Sowell. 2005, he published a book called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. John Burleson in 2002 wrote a book called The Georgia Cracker. And there's a few other references that I'll give you if I remember them. But anyway, if you look at what we have adopted as our culture, which wasn't our true culture, we've adopted those type of traits, believing that that's who we were. In the 1960s, they began to really push the Black identity, and we have to, have our own culture, right? And so, but they didn't understand that the culture they were promoting was not our true culture. If you look at the actual daishiki that a lot of Black people, pro-Blacks, what they call woke or pro-Black people are pushing, a daishiki isn't from West Africa, even though most of the Negroes that were transported over were from West Africa. The daishiki comes from the East African culture. So again, we don't really understand what it is that we, who we are, our past, and we've adapted what people have given us. Jumping the broom is not one of our traditional African cultures. It's just something that was recently adapted. Also from the 1960s, in the late 60s and early 70s, or in the 60s and 70s, what happened is the power structure also began to reinforce this false culture, this white cracker culture, with the genre of music in Hollywood called blaxploitation films. And so blaxploitation films promoted and advanced the idea that this white cracker culture from Southern Europe, Southwestern Europe region, was our culture, right? So in the 1960s, you have blaxploitation that promoted the idea that the Black hustler or drug dealer was someone to be honored. So you had movies like Superfly and The Mac and all these other movies. You had Donald Goines wrote Iceberg Slim, which was a series of books about a pimp. And even though he was writing it as anti-pimp books, he was talking about how he was a pimp. He grew up in that environment and how horrible a pimp was in the Black community. But nevertheless, many people have grabbed a hold of this whole persona of Iceberg Slim and glamorized the pimp in the Black community, right? Even Snoop Dogg, and he's one of his personas is the pimp, right? And so The Mac, which was a very popular movie, and Superfly, all these were movies that were called blaxploitation, and they promoted the worst part of the culture that really wasn't ours. It promoted the whole idea of like the over-sexualized Black person, right? So Black men were really supposed to be like this stud type of idea that, you know, how many women you can conquer was supposed to be honorable in the culture. And just a bunch of other things that we've adapted. If you look at modern hip hop culture, it promotes those same ideas. Unfortunately, that was described historically that the cracker culture of the Scottish and Irish people had adopted. And then you had, of course, things like the over-secularization of the church. And so you had this idea that the church and the world mixed. And so you have people that, the same people that would go out and party on a Saturday night would also be in church, you know, and just this whole idea, a lack of holiness, if you think about it, that has erupted inside of our churches. So other initiatives that actually really hindered our community. You had the war on crime, the war on poverty, you had the war on drugs. These were all ultimately government-run programs that helped to weaken the Black community by weakening the Black family. So what does that mean? So you had the war on crime, and so many areas they started to target, in the inner cities especially, they start to target and racially profile certain people, primarily Black males. You have the war on drugs, which the war on drugs and the war on crime kind of went hand in hand, because it was reported in several different things that the CIA was allowing for the transport of drugs into the Black community, especially the crack cocaine in the 1980s in South Central LA, which also spilled into other parts of the country. You had and so with the war on crime and the war on drugs, where you had racial profiling, you had a larger amount of police officers that were dispatched into the inner city. You had longer sentences for people that sold crack versus powder cocaine, which most of the drug dealers in the inner city that were African-American and Hispanic were selling crack. So for lesser amount of crack cocaine, you got more time than you got for larger amounts of powder cocaine. Now, why is that important? That's important because, I mean, you should get punished if you commit a crime. So I'm not suggesting they shouldn't get punished, but what I'm suggesting is that you have these people that were transporting larger amounts of powder cocaine that weren't Black or Hispanic, right? They're transporting them into the inner cities. And then you have the street corner hustler that has the smaller amount of crack. He's getting more time. But without the powder cocaine and without the source to transport and the distribution into those communities, you wouldn't have crack cocaine. So a lot of people deem this as being one of the ways that they weaken the Black family by targeting the Black males, giving them more time in prison, which not only it weakened the community through weakening the family structure. And so a lot of what we have now in our current culture, the hip hop culture, is a residue, not only from this white cracker culture, Black redneck culture, but also from the post-crack era culture. Now, what do I mean by that? So the crack epidemic not only decimated the Black community by destroying the Black family or weakening the Black family unit, but if you look at the core of hip hop culture now, I'm saying popular hip hop culture, not all hip hop culture. And I was a huge hip hop fan for many years. But what I'm saying is, for instance, one of the most famous genres of hip hop music right now is called trap music. Now, the word trap comes from the idea of the trap house, which is where they had drugs and other illegal activities. So people like T.I. and different things, they made this concept of trap music famous. When you look at what's known now as drill music, right? But well, let's look at hip hop culture right now. So the hustler, the drug dealer, and the pimp are three things that are very much popularized in our current hip hop culture. When you look at Chicago drill music in the South Central LA, like NWA, you know, they talked a lot about the South Central post-crack culture or crack culture. Gang affiliation is now very popular in hip hop music. The Chicago drill music scene glamorizes gang and gang violence, and everyone will tell you when you have the absence of fathers, and when you look at every statistic or sociologist or any law enforcement agency, they'll tell you when you lack males or fathers in the community, gang affiliation or gang violence is always very prevalent. You know, the sexualization of women is very prevalent. And so when you see things, and I did a video, and please like and subscribe to my channel and share it if you find anything beneficial. But when you look at things like WAP or the over-sexualization of women, the over-sexualization of women usually is more prominent when you lack fathers in the society. And what I mean by that, and I'm just speculating or guessing, and this is probably not going to be popular, but people like Cardi B or Megan Thee Stallion or Nicki Minaj probably didn't have a great relationship with their fathers, because and that's a psychological thing. I'm not just coming up with something on my own, but when you think about a young lady who has father issues, right? She doesn't receive the validation from her father. Sigmund Freud talked about the fact that the first man that a young woman falls in love with is her dad, and so that impacts her. Even in her adult life, her relationships with men, how she sees herself, her self-esteem. So when you don't have fathers around to reinforce that self-esteem or reinforce, you know, her not having to be over-sexualized, then you have that over-sexualization in the community, because most dads will not allow their young lady to be over-sexualized, and psychologically she won't have as much of a need for it. And of course, I know people like Megan Thee Stallion and Nicki Minaj and Cardi B are making money, they're entertainers, but what happens is their form of entertainment doesn't take root when you have stronger family and family values, when you have fathers around, because then you have young ladies that aren't as doesn't have a need to be expressed, you know, or valued based on her organs, her body parts and different things like that. And so yeah, so all of these are trickle down effects of that and the corrupted culture. And so just wanted to give you that background. Understand our real culture is not pimps. Young men are not pimps or hustlers or drug dealers. Young ladies, you shouldn't be valued by your waist to butt ratio, how nice your behind is, or your breast, or what you will do physically or sexually. Those are not values that sustain cultures or communities or individuals. It's a self-destructive type of culture that only leads to more pain and hurt and destruction, right? It doesn't lead to better things. It only leads to worse things. And so what we have to do is we have to get back to having people that are our role models in the community are not just men, but strong men, spiritual men, men that have morals and values that line up with the morals and values that help sustain a culture, family values. The pastors have to take a lead in being on the forefront of helping to restore morals and values to the family and the community. And that's the only way we'll succeed. It's not because of racism or lack of resources. Those are secondary issues. But the real issues lie in having a culture that does not promote those things that help us to be long-term and sustainable as individuals and as families and as a community. This has been Joe Green. Until next time, peace and blessings to you. Please like and subscribe and share if you find value to this. And let's continue this conversation going. Have a great rest of your day. Be blessed.